Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us today. And welcome to Regulation Navigation with Warren Miller, brought to you by ITS. This webinar series is centered around regulation-related topics that cover high-level compliance requirements and give you an opportunity to learn something new or validate what you already know or ask questions that are affecting your operation. Today, Warren and I will unpack the second GPAC meeting from this past March. GPAC stands for Gas Pipeline Advisory Committee. This meeting concluded discussion of the leak detection and repair, or LDAR, NPRM rule, and recommended language for PHMSA to include in its final rule. The meeting also included discussion of new regulations for LNG, or liquefied natural gas, and hydrogen, and also a whole other NPRM on class location changes. But our focus today will be on the LDAR rule's impact on natural gas pipelines. We'll recap what GPAC is, what its purpose is, and what was discussed at the follow-up meeting, and then what comes next with the LDAR rule. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping to ensure this experience is beneficial for all of you. This session will be recorded, and as a gentle reminder, the information and views expressed in this webinar series may be opinion and do not constitute legal advice and should not be utilized as your only source of information. So please consider that before acting on any advice given, and seek legal counsel or guidance from your legal counsel or any other applicable experts if you have particular questions, issues, or concerns. We will have time at the end. Looks like we're jumping around on our slides, but hopefully we'll get that technical difficulty settled. Please bear with us. We will have time at the end of the webinar where you can anonymously ask questions about the topics that we discussed today. To do so, please type your questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom. You can do that all along the webinar, and we'll get to them at the end. We'll address your questions. We'll fit them all in if time permits, and give you time to respond, or we'll respond through email or contact you individually, as long as you leave us your contact information. We're now offering 0.1 CEUs, or continuing education units, that you may be able to apply to your professional development hours for attending this webinar. So after the webinar, we'll send out a feedback form that you can fill out and return to us if you'd like a certificate for those CEU credits. Hi, I'm Chris Taylor. I'm ITS's Vice President of Learning and Compliance. And here with me is, as always, is ITS Regulatory Compliance Specialist Warren Miller. Warren, thanks for being here, and thank you all for joining us today. So let's get started. All right, so in March, PHMSA, or as we all know what PHMSA is, but for anyone that may not, that's the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. It conducted its second set of GPAC meetings, and again, Gas Pipeline Advisory Committee. On LDAR, that's the leak detection and repair rule, but it's not a final rule yet. It's not actual regulation as it moves through the process. Right now, it's an NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So after we got all those acronyms out of the way, we'll be using them throughout the rest of the presentation or the webinar. Again, not a final rule yet, but this meeting that just happened in March was a follow-up to the first meeting, and the first time GPAC had met in a long time. They met at the end of November and the beginning of December of last year to cover LDAR and to cover that other NPRM on class locations. And they didn't get through the whole thing in November, December. So they rescheduled. They have another one that they just were able to get through the LDAR. And right after the GPAC meeting, PHMSA had some requests to extend the comment period. So when they do these meetings, you can be in attendance of those meetings and provide public comment. Then you can also publicly comment on the meetings as well. And they received a request to extend the comment period for stakeholders to have more time to provide comments on the topics of discussion, but PHMSA denied that request, saying they've had plenty of time, they've got enough comments. Not to quote them, but that was essentially the gist of it. But they did, so they declined extending comments on GPAC related to the LDAR NPRM, but they did grant the request to extend comments, the comment period for the class location NPRM all the way to August 27th. So if that affects your operations, we really, like we always do, encourage you to get engaged in the rulemaking process and provide public comment. PHMSA, so in that class location, let's see, we're not going to cover that class location NPRM today. We're really just going to focus on LDAR, and again, focus really just on natural gas. Before we get into the specifics of the March GPAC meeting, Warren, can you give us just a quick reminder of what GPAC is? What is their purpose?
Thanks, Chris. GPAC is utilized by PHMSA to get feedback on proposed rulemaking that affects the natural gas side of the regulated pipelines and facilities. These 15 individuals on the committee represent federal and state agencies, the natural gas industry, members of the public, and other interest groups. They're all appointed, and they sit there, and they exist to address the rulemaking proposals to ensure they're technically feasible, reasonable, cost-effective, and practicable. They also can suggest language to PHMSA to consider to either modify, include, or even request deletion in that final rule that PHMSA will be developing.
It covered a lot of ground, especially around leak surveys, leak detection and repair, leak grading, leak repair criteria, and they got about what was considered halfway through their agenda back in the first meeting. This meeting they kicked off with a discussion on gas gathering and really continuing that forward. Why? Warren, why is gas gathering? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Why was that discussed specifically?
In the world of pipeline safety, jurisdiction over the gathering lines hasn't been around that long. It's certainly been talked about, but officially codified, not been around. So many of these lines are remote, and much of it has not been mapped. A lot of this was put in by exploration production companies that were never an operator as such, like the transmission pipeline operators are. There may be a general idea of some of the locations, but when many of these were installed, pipeline safeties weren't even considered by that side of the industry. Now the regulations are proposed for these. Some of these will be new operators to leak survey and make certain repairs dependent on type. I don't think PHMSA has accurately predicted the costs associated with the compliance for these new operators for these requirements. And it's going to be quite the undertaking.
Yeah, gathering lines are classified as A, B, or C types. Warren, can you just give us a primer on those, like on the types themselves? Does diameter of the line itself or its location play into how they're classified?
The diameter, some, but more it's the pressure, what the operating pressure, stress pressures are. There's a table for this information in part 192.8, but it's kind of somewhat confusing. Just quickly, and I won't cover all of it, but type A is steel pipe, and with an MAOP that produces a hoop stress of 20% or more of SMICE in a class 2, 3, and 4 locations, or if an operator has non-metallic pipe with an MAOP above 125. Type B, again, is steel pipe, but the MAOP produces a hoop stress of less than 20% and is in class 3 or class 4 locations. And then there's some guidelines for class 2. And then that non-metallic pipe with MAOP of 125 pounds or less. And then type C is the one that starts talking about the diameter with an outside diameter of 8.625 inches or greater in a class 1 that meets any of the following. So basically, if it's steel in a MAOP with a hoop stress of 20% or non-metallic pipe at 125. There are some additional considerations that for an operator who does not know his stress level, and that's addressed in that table.
So if I'm understanding type C correctly, with these being class 1, these are likely the most remote gathering lines, possibly with lower pressure. What do you think operators are going to develop as a strategy to address these lines with them being, in such remote areas at times?
Well, I think a big thing is a number of these guys were never operators, like we have transmission and distribution and hazardous liquid. Um, so they've had to learn everything. They've had to, get an operator ID. In some cases, develop that O&M. Now, with this proposed regulation, they're going to have additional meet additional requirements. And, it's not a small or cheap undertaking, especially for somebody who has never, put resources toward that.
Well, that makes sense. Warren, the GPAC voted unanimously to include Type C gathering lines in the Advanced Leak Detection Program Performance Standards with a 5-year leakage survey interval. So, what will that involve?
I honestly don't know. As I said before, many of these pipelines are in very remote areas. There's no, power, auxiliary power just running around, and these remote, the considerations for what are going to be advanced leak detection, those are going to be, quite an undertaking. I'm thinking about West Texas, outside of Midland, out there across some of that country that's, you know, desert in a lot of places. And so the cost to install some of the technology may cause many of these operators to actually reconsider their operations. I know that GPAC voted 13-0 on this advanced leak detection program, but I don't know that they really considered if the proposal was technically feasible, reasonable, cost effective, or practical, in my opinion.
Yeah, what comes to mind is maybe to me, I was thinking maybe they'll have to utilize some of that satellite technology we've seen, and some kind of way to look for leaks and then go pinpoint areas where they see plumes. Or it's going to be really interesting to see how they tackle all that. Before we move on to other subjects, is there anything else that you think we should discuss while we're on the subject of gathering?
Yeah, it was also voted that an annual leak survey must be made for type A and B lines. Type C, if they're larger than 16 inch, or if they're between 8 inches and 16 inches, and the segments that might contain a building for human occupancy or a site with a potential impact radius or a class location unit. So there are those additional requirements that will have to be reviewed by operators.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. Another topic that was discussed and voted on was regarding extending the National Pipeline Mapping System, or NPMS, and having that as a requirement for regulated gas gathering pipelines. And there was a split vote on the proposed rule for the type A, B, and C lines. here's what the proposed regulation says. Pipeline safety stakeholders use NPMS to obtain important pipeline safety related information, including the locations of pipelines and the related infrastructure, the names and the contact information of pipeline operators, and other attributes of pipelines, such as what commodities are transported and their diameter. So my understanding is that an NPMS helps with damage prevention programs, emergency response programs, and emergency responders, and the drills that they run through, emergency response drills, and as well as maps and records. But can you help us better understand NPMS and what are its benefits and maybe what are its drawbacks? Why was this a split vote?
Well, certainly PHMSA needed to know where pipelines were that they were actually, had jurisdiction over. So NPMS was a program developed by PHMSA and with the help of some outside folks years ago, and it was to hold information on that was jurisdictional lines across the country. So you break down by county, state. Currently this is only transmission pipelines for natural gas and hazardous liquids. There is no gathering or distribution pipeline data on it for now. There are two different views available. There's a public viewer, so anybody can go in and say, I live in Callaway County, Kentucky. I want to know what pipelines cross here. And if there's any transmission pipelines running across it, it will show up. It will tell me who the operator is. That will actually give a real close indication of actually where the pipeline runs. Then there are, and part with the public is there are some people who believe that it's gives a little too much information for those people who might not be happy with pipelines. Could give out some, information that could cause them damage. Then there's those operators and other folks that have an NPMS account, again, mainly for operators, that they go in, they can actually upload information, the spatial information that they have to review. And if they've changed their mapping in a year's time, then they have a certain requirement to upload new data. To comply with the proposed regulations, operators, especially the folks that have the gathering lines, will have to hire crews with associated equipment to gather that spatial data that PHMSA is requiring. And I'll just tell you, with the shortage of qualified personnel and the amount of pipe that will have to be mapped within the implementation time, operators' cost to comply may dramatically increase to supply and demand.
So, in short, there's a whole lot of work ahead if that ends up being part of the final rule.
Very much so.
GPAC voted unanimously on the leak survey frequency, but then they had a split vote. Do you think there's any significance to that?
I think it is. I think some of the members voted doing what they were supposed to do. They considered that this proposal was not technically feasible, reasonable, or cost effective. And they voted, they voted against it.
Do you think that, where do you think the proposed, for those that were for, where does it fall short? Or where does it fall short of being technically feasible, reasonable, cost effective, and practicable?
Well, first off, I got to remember that pipeline safety regulations were established to protect people first, property second. The addition of the environment concerns came later. So many of these lines that are remote and do not pose that safety issue. PHMSA is asking for a lot of money to be spent on it, low risk issues. And I don't think that PHMSA actually correctly estimated the cost to justify the regulation as it's written. Again, in my opinion.
Yeah, interesting. Well, either way, it's gonna likely be law, and we'll see how folks will have to comply and what they'll have to do. Let's move to another topic. This is an important one that was in the GPAC meeting, and it was large volume release reporting. the focus of the discussion here was making reporting less burdensome on industry. That was the discussion. And folks, these discussions are like negotiations between industry representatives, the public, and governmental representatives. Um, and so part of the discussion was making reporting less burdensome by moving it from monthly, as it was proposed originally, to quarterly, but while also specifying volume requirements. So getting more specific. The votes ended up being unanimous, but digging into the details a little bit here, why do you think they all agreed on this one, Warren?
I think just getting the burden from 12 to 4 times a year was, a major event as the discussion went. I know hopefully most operators don't have to report that often. Hopefully they don't have these kind of leaks to have to report. The flow rates compare with the EPA criteria. And I think that's the big thing here is the fact that operators won't be requiring to keep two lists of releases and the reporting criteria. And so not, muddy in the waters having to say, okay, which one was this EPA, was this PHMSA criteria, and then how often do we report? So that made, I think that's how they got on that, where they were able to agree.
So speaking of flow rates, I think it's a flow rate of 100 kilograms per hour, or 500,000 cubic feet that flows into the atmosphere within 4 days. That's a really big release, right? Like, I have trouble visualizing this. So can you try to paint us a picture? Just how much gas is that would have to be reported?
Well, if I've calculated it right, and I'm known to make miscalculations, but 100 kilograms per hour is equivalent to about 5,000 standard cubic feet per hour. That's about 120,000 standard cubic feet per day. And so that 500,000 standard cubic feet in 4 days is equivalent to about 125,000. So, it's very comparative. So between those two rates, the average house uses 175 standard cubic feet per day. Of course, some use a lot less, some use a lot more. So this leak would supply about 700 average homes per day. It sounds like a lot, but in the world of transmission pipelines and flow rates, a 5,000 standard cubic feet per hour leak on a pipeline moving, say, 10 to 300 million standard cubic feet per day could be very hard to detect in a few days. At 10 million standard cubic per day, a 5,000 standard cubic feet per hour is about 1.2% of the flow. But if you've got a pipeline running at 300 million, 5,000 is 400ths of a percent of the flow.
That really helps me. I mean, and to see this kind of breakdown on screen, thank goodness we got that back. Wow. Well, I hope audience, I hope you guys got all that, because there will be a test later. I'm just joking, but thank you, Warren. That the flow rates is something new to me anyway, and maybe to industry in general. Having to consider those, especially in regulation and compliance. Well, stepping back for a moment to look at the conclusions from both the meetings in November and March, what are the biggest changes that you anticipate coming to the industry in general? And again, folks, this is all NPRM. It's not over until they issue a final rule. And even if PHMSA is not bound to adopt these recommendations, and they're not, as I understand it, what do you think the biggest, looking into your crystal ball, what do you think the biggest conclusions are, the biggest changes that'll be affecting operators?
It's tough to answer, Chris. Nobody's got that crystal ball right now. It's, totally in PHMSA's hands. But, first off, this advanced leak detection program for every operator. implementation for a number of operators affected could make it tough to get something in place by the effective date, especially for these gathering operators. Um, you know, hopefully PHMSA is going to provide guidance. Uh, it's quite an undertaking, quite a lot of specifics in the program requirement itself. And then the increase on the leakage surveys for both transmission and distribution, which is now including gathering. Operators may have to add personnel, if their equipment doesn't meet spec, they may have to have new equipment. And that would include now training and evaluating for OQ, procedures. And then since OQ specifically been called out, so anybody involved in surveying, investigation, and repair of leaks has to have OQ. There will be no span of control by the way it is proposed. Now, PHMSA may provide guidance otherwise, but me reading it black and white, everybody that does those surveys or investigations or leaks will have to have a qualification.
Interesting. Not to mention, what I think of the fact that when there's more surveying that will be done, and there will be, as a result of this, do you think it's pretty likely that that will result in more discovery of leaks and then more repair and kind of there's going to be a lot of work created here? It's going to be interesting.
It may or may not. Folks may find additional leaks. During these more additional intervals on certain pipe that's known to leak, like cast iron. You probably could go out every day on some pipe and find another leak. But for those operators that have new or newer pipe in the ground, more surveys might not result in more leaks. This is where I was really hoping that they would stay with a little bit of risk based, possibly on pipe, but that was never mentioned. So it really just depends on the operator and their system.
That strikes me right there. Just it depends. Because I really find it interesting having some conversations. Some operators are going to be much more affected than others by what it looks like of this rulemaking. So aside from operators with a considerable amount of leak-prone pipe, like you talked about, cast iron, for instance, many of the public-owned distribution system operators I've heard from say they're basically already fixing all the leaks they find within a year. They probably won't even grade them as threes moving forward because of what it looks like and the more stringent requirements to carry grade threes and check on them. But then there are larger investor-owned sometimes systems that may be carrying a significant amount of grade threes on their books, and they're going to have to prioritize that repair within a time frame with consideration of pipeline repair projects, because there's some exceptions there. And then, of course, we just talked about last webinar and this on transmission and gathering operators. A lot of different sectors are affected here. What do you think? What sector do you think really will be the hardest hit for compliance to have to comply with this rule as it looks now?
I think any operator that's been carrying grade 3 leaks for years, and that's typically not the transmission side, they'll be hit the hardest because they're going to have to, they'll be stepping up their leak surveys, so finding new ones. Plus, they've got this backlog of old ones. And so trying to meet the requirements of getting the new ones repaired and the grade 3 leaks repaired at the same time, again, is going to have an impact on resources, personnel, equipment. It could be, quite a hit on operations. And one other thing that's kind of been not there, and I've talked about much, but that's not been mentioned, but that I think can greatly impact operations, is the definition of failure that they have proposed. So PHMSA proposed that they change failure definition to when any portion of a pipeline becomes inoperable or is incapable of safely performing its intended function or has become unreliable or unsafe for continued use. Can, being an ex-regulator, I read this as saying if an operator finds, say, excavation damage, a pretty good cut in a plastic pipe, and it's past that depth that you can safely operate the pipe, it's got to get cut out. By reading this, it says, this is a failure. So I've actually got to do a failure investigation of why this happened. And then you've got additional things you have to review by requirement under 617 for seeing if there's something in OQ and training and procedure that could have prevented this. It means more documentation. Certainly, each time something like this occurs, kind of reads like an FAA requirement rather than instead of PHMSA.
Interesting. Yeah. I guess hearing, watch out for cascading effects of even simple changes to definition could require more documentation. Do you anticipate this change in the definition of pipeline failure to, like how much more documentation and records would that end up being than at present, do you think? If that's right.
Certainly by the letter of the law, unless PHMSA gives additional direction, every time pipe, is corroded to the point that it's got to be removed, it would require an investigation with documentation and lessons learned. It would be, it's going to create quite a bit of work if the definition of failure changes and PHMSA doesn't provide some pretty tight, good guidance on.
Thanks for pointing that one out. I didn't see it myself. Besides answering the what of the GPAC meeting, a lot of folks in the industry are asking when. When is all of this going to be required for compliance? What are those timelines recommended by the GPAC? What can we expect, Warren?
Well, again, understanding that GPAC recommended guidelines. PHMSA may require shorter. They may, be able to push, timelines out. But right now, again, as what GPAC had voted on is they were hoping to have a phase one where each operator would have about 18 months to develop an advanced leak detection program suitable for their system. Remember, one size is not going to fit all, and there's so many variables across the United States. 18 months is appropriate for that development. And I'll tell you about two things. You've got an effective date and you have a publication date. So be very aware as we're talking here because they are two totally different dates. Phase two, you have to be, the compliance date will be 36 months, but that will be from the date of publication, which, seems long, but operators have so much to complete before then. So the day that the final rule hits the pavement, let's say December 1st, the effect, the date of publication is December 1st, and the date of the effective date may be 3 months or 6 months from that point. So you're going to have varying timelines. So I believe there's we've got a ton of a timeline, or if we don't, we're working on one to kind of show how this plays out. But that compliance date of 36 months also includes that development of that advanced leak detection. So it's part of that implementation. And then on the side also is reporting. So reporting those intentional large volume releases, we talked about the flow rates, every quarter would start within 24 months of the publication date. So it's operators will have to, prepare and get strategies on, forms or whatever they're going to use to make those reports. And then leaks themselves, there were numerous comments and concerns of the GPAC committee regarding leaks that already exist before the compliance date of the rule. There was no deadline recommended on that.
Yeah, thanks. And that is on screen, at least for me, hopefully for everyone else as well, as we've had fun today with tech. Warren, do you think it's fair to say that the next thing we see from PHMSA on this is issuance of the final rule?
I do. I was actually able to listen to Alan Mayberry from PHMSA yesterday, talking to the Western NAPSR meeting out here, and he said that it will be the last quarter of 24 or the first quarter of 25 that the final rule will be published. And again, that's important to see those dates when they come out.
Yeah. So it'll be published, then they'll have an effective date, and then different varying aspects will be required at future times. Thank you so much, Warren. I know for anyone, this is a lot. The LDAR NPRM is pretty voluminous, has a lot of public comment, and we covered a good amount of the first GPAC meeting on this. And you can find out more if you go to its-training.com/regnav. We've got our past recorded webinars there. So if you're interested, that's a great resource to kind of see the other pieces that were discussed in November, December of last year at that first GPAC meeting. And it's been really great to understand this whole process. For me, especially the first time attending a GPAC meeting and really seeing how some of the sausage is made, if you will. It's time for you to be able to enter in your questions and answers into the Q&A chat box feature in Zoom. Note if we run out of time, and it looks like we got a plenty amount of time left, we will follow up after the webinar with you individually, as long as you give us your contact information. Sometimes folks sign up and register with their contact information, and sometimes they do so anonymously. So if you're one of those anonymous folks and you do put a question and answer in, please put that in there so we can get back to you. And thanks for engaging with us. While we wait for your questions, let's recap our 5 main takeaways from this webinar. Warren?
Just remember that, that the LDR, all the comments, everything that PHMSA is looking at has already been in as of April 29th. If you do want to put in comments on the gas distribution, you do have till late August to get those comments in. I really recommend that anybody from your company, as a company, as individuals, you're welcome to add those comments. This is your opportunity to, make comments, whether, good or bad. Just remember that you got to have reasonable discussion. You haven't looked at the cost right, or you haven't considered this. If you're an operator, let your company leadership know, if they're not aware already, that there is impending regulation coming and that it will affect your operations. You may want to provide the voting slides from GPAC so they're aware of the possible changes. Be one of the things that we'll send out to you after this is over. I really recommend you don't go out and buy new equipment until this regulation comes out as a final rule. Again, there are some specific requirements about sensitivity and things like that, but again, it was proposed. So some of this rule-making language may change before it hits the final rule. And do prepare for change. This will affect operations and maintenance, training, and certainly OQ for most, if not all, operators. You're going to have certainly those qualified people if they're doing any type of surveying, grading, or repair of leaks. And with the plethora of requirements, just plan on the change. And then, as we talked about, when it will be final, that best estimate is last quarter of this year or first quarter. There's quite a process that PHMSA has to go through up in DC through different departments before this can be published. And with this also being a voting year, anything can change. Certainly, we saw that happen with the proposed NPRM for OQ back in 20, I'm sorry, and how it didn't fly through. So certain things could change. That's why first quarter of 25 is maybe pushed out too. Need to review to see if PHMSA followed GPAC recommendations or on the implementation dates, and also their voting that they provided. I will tell you that in most cases PHMSA has followed GPAC in past history, and we'll just see if they do this time. And just also to make sure, Chris, everybody understands, we've just covered some of the high points. There's a number of other points that PHMSA had proposed regulatory changes. Certainly definitions were added. Please review and be aware that GPAC has of what GPAC approved, and know that be prepared. It's a lot to review. But I think it's all documented in the PowerPoints that we're going to share with you.
Yeah, thank you for that recap, Warren. And speaking of that, in our follow-up email after the webinar, we'll send you these takeaways. We'll send you a link to the LDAR NPRM as it was initially proposed, and a link to that GPAC meeting where you can, if you have a lot of time, you can read through the entire transcript of the 5 days where they met, or the 10 days total that they met. But they also have downloadable those voting slides that they worked through. And that's really, and with the language that they sent back to PHMSA on, could be very helpful. And thank you. Those are really great takeaways. So again, don't forget your opportunity to obtain continuing education units. We'll also, for credit for that, we'll also be sending out a feedback form for this webinar. We'd love to hear from you, but in that you can also signal to us that you would like a certificate for those CEU credits. At this time, we'd like to talk through your questions. So if you haven't done so yet, please enter your question into the Q&A feature so we can share them with Warren here, and he can answer them as best he can. Again, if we don't get to your question here on air, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually. So as we give you a moment to pose your questions, I'd like to also remind you that this is an NPRM, a notice of proposed rulemaking. It's not regulation yet. If this has you thinking about your compliance situation, though, especially around management of change, and you're not alone. So many struggle with this, and ITS is able to help with that. We have a number of solutions for operator qualification and operations and maintenance procedure change management. And if you're interested in any consulting services from ITS, Warren has extensive experience, and he'll be able to help your operations in various capacities. So please reach out to us if any of this strikes you. Our follow-up email will include a link to learn more about that as well. All right, Warren, first up, we've got a few questions in. First up, does PHMSA always follow, I think you just answered this, but does PHMSA always follow GPAC's recommendations?
Again, for the most part, they do. There's a lot of actually scrutiny when putting these members on this committee. Everything's on docket, so PHMSA has to consider. And again, when this final rule does come out, you can imagine it's going to be quite the document. And it will, as it comes out, it'll say, okay, this is the publication date, this is the effective date, and then they're going to give their reasoning from from start to finish, from why it was developed, and then they'll go through the discussion on the comments. They'll have categorized the comments and saying, okay, we had 35,000 comments. These 30,000 were from a sample. They won't say it. This is what I would do, but they'll say this was a form letter that these folks sent. The people that did respond and break it down. We accept this. We don't accept this. PHMSA considered this, whatever it is. And then they'll talk about what the GPAC talked about, what they provided, and then whether PHMSA agrees or disagrees. Now, PHMSA may take 75% of what GPAC recommends, and they may hold tight. Again, you have to understand there's also NTSB, there's the congressional mandates that were worded certain ways. There's, industry has, certainly put out quite a few rebuttals to some of the language. So there's a number of things. And then the cost of this, I believe, will probably have to be addressed because they were called during that November meeting to the carpet about the cost that they had estimated to justify this regulation. And I believe we were looking at probably, they got it about 50% right. They mismarked it that far. So there's a number of things that will be out. But then in the final language at the end of that document will be, here is the final rule. This is what that regulation is. Either we've amended or we've added new sections like 192, 760, 764. Those are going to be brand new pieces in the regulations that operators will have to follow. Again, depending on what kind of operator you are, taking a look to make sure, okay, this applies to me, this part doesn't apply to me. It's quite the undertaking once you get in to look at it.
Yeah, thanks for that outlook. A few people are asking, would a potential administration change this November have any impact on the final rule issuance?
I think with the congressional mandate, and where this one came from with the methane emissions and with most of the political world, it probably would not change it much. It might change when it comes out, just kind of depending on the legalities and being able to move things through. But I don't believe that no matter who gets in there, that this one would change. But that said, anything is possible. But me personally, I don't think that would happen right now.
With back to the definition of failure, with that being redefined, someone comments, I could see that being inclusive of any leak being considered a failure and therefore requiring an investigation. What are your thoughts?
Again, that's the concern, being so vague and nebulous, even PHMSA may think it's going to be this way. A state regulator may go, hey, no, it's a leak. It can't hold it can't hold product. So it's, it meets this requirement as a failure. That's why I'm hoping that there's some better guidance on what they're intending, because that could be really tough for operators across the country with different states under, just taking it, well, I believe it means this.
Thank you. When you spoke about span of control earlier, someone asks, well, do you foresee that being applied to distribution? I guess that was in regard to leak survey in general.
The way the proposed regulation said, it said all. It did not give any. It didn't get, and with them calling it out specifically, that anybody doing that would have to be qualified. Again, unless PHMSA provides guidance, if I was a regulator, if I was an inspector, I would read that, mean anybody on that job site has to be qualified. Unless you can definitely say this is our person who is doing that grading. These other two are assisting. They're getting equipment ready and things like that. They're not involved in repair. Now, if they're involved in that repair, I think that's going to be that part that everybody hands-on would have to be. But if you can say, this is my person who grades, this is my person who surveys, and these others are helpers, it'd be kind of like the welder and his assistant, things like that.
What is, someone asks, and we have a few more minutes, so what is your opinion on the level of detail that will be required regarding the quantification of that leak rate or the volume of gas that was lost, both in terms of leak grading and annual reporting? What, I guess, level of detail?
Yeah, that's, the thing is, when they started going into the rates, 100 kilograms per hour, or, and things like this, that gets past my knowledge about, gauging a leak. That's going to have to, I'll have to have training to even answer the question. I'm sorry, because, this is one of those areas that I don't have enough information on. Certainly there's going to be somebody that's got equipment that can say, okay, this is leaking, 50 kilograms per hour, or whatever it is. And again, there's going to be things that I think everybody's going to have to learn.
Wow. Yeah, you can't know it all, and that's all good. How do you think this is going to change leak surveys on the distribution side, and will the amount of area survey be changed? I know there was some definitely a consideration of change of years, and then maybe something around business districts. Is that true?
Right. Certainly going to, especially in for the outside of the business districts, I believe it was going to every 3 years, not to exceed 39 months from 5 years. And of course, there have been some states that already have gone there. But there's also the requirements if you have known pipe, if you have knowledge about pipe that is, conducive to leaking, that you would also have to do that more often, like, once a year. And I think also the distribution systems that have anode only protection would have to be once a year also. But I don't have my notes right in front of me on that.
Sure. Someone asks, what changes specifically are, I guess, what notable changes are specifically going to be made to leak detection? I remember there was, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Again, they've got a whole laundry list of what grade 1 and grade 2 leaks are now.
Mm-hmm.
The grade 3 was just going to be staying with the GPTC, which is gas piping tech.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. My brother's on the committee, but I can't remember that.
I think, yeah, Gas Pipeline Technology Committee, and maybe.
There we go. Thank you.
I'll look it up.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just too old for this anymore. And but they're going to go with that definition for grade 3s. So there will be those additional requirements of grading, a much tighter. It looks to me by what they've proposed, a much tighter grading system, more defined, very specific locations that you have to also survey, and then again the number of times you have to leak survey. So again, it's quite a bit to take, and I believe it's 192, 760, and 764. That's the proposal. So are we going to be sending the NPRM, or I think we ought to send the NPRM out. So if you'll look in that area specifically, it's a lot more than I can cover in 2 minutes. And but take a look at it, and certainly if you've got any questions, get back to me.
Absolutely. And again, we'll wait don't wait, but know that this is just a notice of proposed rulemaking, and it could all change when they issue that final rule. Looks like we just have one more question we can cover in the time we have. For pipe that's scheduled for replacement, what are the conditions for extending that repair schedule anticipated to be?
Again, this is one of those that was proposed by GPAC. And if somebody has had pipe scheduled, they were allowing, I think on the grade 2 that they were allowing for a 1 year extension out to 2 years. And distribution had given, I'm sorry, they'd given a 7-year window if the pipe had been planned to be replaced, which I honestly don't see how PHMSA will allow 7-year window extension for that. With everything that's, there's still those safety issues out there too. But if they were to allow that, they're certainly having to go back and revisit, either each 6 months or each year, depending on what the situation was.
Yeah, thank you, Warren. And again, look into the regulation. And there's a lot there, a lot coming. Nothing's final yet. Thank you for your time, your expertise, and sharing that with us today, Warren. Thank you all for joining us online. Please mark your calendar for our next webinar that's scheduled tentatively for September 11th. Stay tuned and please stay safe.